Hi, I'm Stu from HiveMind Automation and welcome to the Hive. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at an overview of helper entities in Home Assistant. As we go through these helper entities, you'll note that we've looked at some of them individually in previous videos, but in this video, we're going to go through all of them, talk a little bit about each one, and discuss why they are helpful, as the name suggests. So while I roll the intro, why don't you take a moment to subscribe? And if you hit the bell icon, you'll get a notification when I release new videos, and that's normally every week. While you're at it, if you enjoy what I do here and you want to help to support the channel, there are a few different ways to do that in the video description, such as affiliate links to some of the home automation gadgets that I have reviewed in the past, and some other ways to support the channel, such as signing up for NordVPN using my affiliate link, or supporting the channel directly through my Buy Me a Coffee link. With all of that out of the way, let's get started. So in previous videos, we've spoken about using helper entities like groups, or being able to change the entity type of a switch to a light or a fan, or those kinds of things. And we've even looked at some numerical entity helpers to improve our interactions with our smart home. The basic premise is in the name. It's a helper that provides you with the specific function that you need to either convert the data that you need into a data type that you need, or have an interaction with your smart home just the way you need it, or the way that makes sense the most. So let's head over to Home Assistant and take a look at helper entities. So helper entities are found in settings and then devices and services, and we have helpers over on the right hand side. And if we click create helper, we'll get a list of all the helpers that we can create. And by default, there are 16 helper entities available to create in Home Assistant. And it's worth mentioning that some hacks add-ons will add even more. They range from basic helpers like a button, a toggle, a number, a date or time helper, or text fields, to more complex helpers that perform mathematical calculations, like the derivative sensor, the Riemann Sum sensor, and the min-max mean median sensor. So I'm going to run through these, starting at the basic helper types, and we'll work our way up to the more complex helpers. Now in this video, I'm just going to go over a brief overview of each of these helpers, and in future videos, I'll break down each one and we'll actually take a look at practical examples in a future video, and some of these we've done in the past as well. Starting off with possibly the most basic helper entity, we have the button entity, and it does what it says on the box. It creates a button that we can then use to trigger an automation. This might be particularly useful if you just want a button on your dashboard that can then trigger a light on and off, or trigger a countdown or something like that, and we'll talk about countdowns shortly. Jumping around a little bit in the list, if we scroll down, we'll see that we have the toggle helper. Under the hood, this creates what's called an input Boolean entity. You can basically think of the toggle helper as creating a switch, and that's how it's going to appear to Home Assistant in the dashboard. You can then interact with the toggle in an automation to turn that toggle on or off, and then use the state of that toggle in other automations as a condition, or the state change of that toggle as a trigger. I will be doing a separate video on how I used this specific type of helper entity to solve a problem that I was having in my smart home that was quite frustrating. So get subscribed so you don't miss out on that troubleshooting episode. Next up, if we scroll back up, we have a drop-down entity, and again, this is going to be a pretty simple concept. We can use this drop-down entity to create a drop-down menu and define any number of values that are available in that drop-down menu. We could then use the value of that drop-down as a condition in an automation, or even change the value of that menu when another automation triggers. And we'll use this example a little bit later on. You could perhaps define the rooms that have alarm sensors, and when an automation triggers the alarm, you could then have it also change the alarm state to the room that triggered the alarm, and then use that information to know exactly where to look for any issues. Next up, text fields. Again, it's going to do what it says on the box. It creates a field which you can enter arbitrary text. Once you've got a text field defined in Home Assistant, you can then have an automation push a value into that field. And then in an automation that uses notifications, you could then use the templating engine to add the value of your text field into your notification. As I mentioned before, if you were to set up an alarm using Home Assistant, you can have the text field change to the value of the sensor that triggered the alarm, and then push that in the notification so you know exactly which area of the house to look at on cameras when the alarm goes off. Now, the caveat here is that I've still not managed to get that particular use case to work properly, but I haven't had a chance to really spend much time on that. When I do manage to get that working, I will put together a video demonstrating how I did that. Next, we'll look at number fields, and again, they do what they say. We can have an input field or a slider input, define a numerical value. And with these helpers, we can define both the minimum and the maximum values. And then we can also define the steps between values. Now, I've demonstrated this in a previous video where I took the value of a number field slider to then control the brightness of a light group based on the time of day. You can use a value change of the slider as a trigger in an automation, as well as a templated value in the automation action, so that you can then use the value of the numerical slider to set the percentage of the brightness of your lights. Or you could even also use these numerical fields to control things like the color temperature of your lights, or the transition times, or any number of other numerical values that you have available with your integrations. Next up, we'll talk about date and time entities. And there's actually 3 different ways that you can configure a date time helper. You can configure a date entity, you can configure a time entity, or, as the name suggests, a date and time entity. The date time helpers can then be used as triggers in automations, so you could set a time to trigger an automation that helps you wake up. So for example, you could have an automation that triggers a sunrise scene on your bedroom smart lights and plays some music on some smart speakers, or even turns the heater on at a certain time. You can then use an automation to change the value in that time setup based on the day of the week that it is. So for example, if you don't want to wake up quite as early on a Saturday or Sunday, you could set that time to a bit later in the day. And then on Monday morning, you have the time automatically change back to the earlier time. For the date entity helper, you can use these dates to trigger notifications, like reminding you about important dates like birthdays or anniversaries. And lastly, the date time helper can help you to trigger an automation on a specific date at a specific time. In a similar vein, we have the times of day sensor, and it's pretty interesting. And it, like the toggle, it essentially creates a Boolean sensor that is set to on between certain times of day. For example, you could set it up for working hours or school time and use the value of that sensor as a condition in your automations. For example, if you have an automation that turns the office light off when there's no motion detected, you could set up a condition to only run that automation if the work time sensor is set to no. So during working hours, the light in the office just stays on. Next up, similar to the time of day helper, we have the schedule helper. Again, the schedule helper is going to create a Boolean sensor, and then you define a schedule where you will set up the times where you want the Boolean sensor to be on. And this can be rather arbitrary. You could potentially set this up to be your work schedule if you work shift work. The obvious limitation with the time of day helper is that it's not concerned about what day of the week it is, but the schedule helper is only on at the times and days that you define when you set up the helper. It does appear, however, that there might be some limitations with the schedule helper because it only offers a 7-day period, whereas some shift workers, for example, might need a 14-day or more cycle. Next up, timer entities. Timer entities can be created to then trigger an automation at the completion of a countdown timer, and you can reasonably set up a physical button to trigger the timer start. The timer entity does create a button within the UI to start the timer. At the end of the countdown timer, you can then trigger an accessory like a light, fan, or even smart tap to turn on or off, or just send a notification to your phone or to your smart speakers around the house to tell you to take the pizza out of the oven. Next up, changing the device type of a switch. We've seen this before, and it's worth mentioning that it does only work for switch entities, but we can use this helper to change a switch entity into either a cover, a fan, a light, a lock, or a siren entity. Now, I have smart switches installed in my hallway lights, and I use this type of helper to then change those switch entities into light entities. It does make life a little bit easier when you are setting up automations, and it's also helpful if you're wanting to make use of the next helper type, which is group entity. Now, there's no prizes for guessing what group entities does. It groups like entities together to then operate them together. It's important to note that it only groups like entities together. So, for example, you can only group lights with lights, switches with switches, locks with locks, etc. This is particularly useful when you have multiple lights in one area. For example, my dining room here where I film these videos, I have 4 smart downlights, and those are grouped together using an entity group in Home Assistant. The hallway lights that I mentioned before are also grouped together in an entity group in Home Assistant, and the 6 smart downlights in my lounge room as well, the 3 smart downlights in my kitchen, etc. This is particularly valuable if you want to activate and deactivate all of these entities at the same time, and especially if you have something like smart downlights that also do RGB, if you want to be able to set them all to the same color temperature, etc. at the same time. From here, we're starting to get into the weeds and a little bit into the more advanced helpers. And I'm going to start by talking about the threshold sensor. Now, you might think that a threshold sensor is fairly simple, but there are actually 3 different modes of operation with the threshold sensor. And there's also an option in here to add hysteresis, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. With the threshold sensor, you are creating a binary sensor that turns on and off depending on the value of an input sensor. If you only configure the lower limit of the threshold sensor, the sensor will only set to a state of on when the input sensor's value is less than the lower limit variable in the helper entity. If you only configure the upper limit, the sensor will only turn on when the input sensor is above that upper limit. And lastly, if you configure both the upper and the lower limits, the entity will be on only when the input sensor value is within that range. There is the additional setting, as I mentioned before, when you configure these entities called hysteresis. And looking at the documentation, it says that this is the distance that the observed value must be from the threshold before the state is changed. So if you want your threshold sensor to be a minimum of, say, 5 degrees away from your lower limit, before it then changes to on, you could set that up. Now, using the threshold sensor, you could reasonably create multiple threshold sensors with various ranges. And that might be especially useful to integrate, say, with a solar system and an RGB light, like a small strip of LEDs being controlled with WLED. This way you could measure your solar output, and let's say the threshold is between 0 and 1500 watts. You could set the LED strip to be red. From 1500 to 2500 watts, you could make it go yellow, and above 2500, it could be green, and that is just an example. Another example would be with a whole house power monitor like the Rainforest Eagle 200. You could use threshold sensors to set the light to green when your energy consumption is less than 0, blue when it's at 0, and orange or red when it's above 0. Next up, we'll talk about the min, max, mean, and median sensor. Now, as the name suggests, this helper type creates a sensor with either the minimum of the input sensors, the maximum of the input sensors, the mean value, and that is the sum of all the values divided by the quantity of values, or the median value of the input sensors. And the median is the middlemost value in a sorted list of all the input values. So if you wanted to get the average temperature of your home, you could set up all of your temperature sensors as input entities into one of these, and then choose either the mean or median value using this helper sensor, or even select the min or the max temp in your home to output that to its own sensor, and even chart that if you like. Next up, for more complexity, we have derivative sensors, and you can use these sensors to generate an estimate of the rate of change of the input sensor. When setting this up, you're going to define the input sensor, the level of precision that you need to however many decimal places you want, and you're going to also define a time window. This might be good if you've got a smart rain gauge. You could use this helper to estimate rainfall over a time period. It's worth mentioning that this is only going to be an estimate, and this may change depending on whether your sensors reset to 0 after power failures, etc. Next up, we have the utility meter helper. Again, we are taking an input sensor, and we can then define things like a reset cycle for the meter. And this can be anything from 15 minutes to once per year. It's worth mentioning as well that there's a meter reset offset, so you can set a number of days from the start of a month, for example, where it will reset. So if your meter reading is normally on the 15th, you could set the meter reset cycle to monthly and set the offset to 15 days. The other thing to note here with the utility meter helper is that you can define a list of supported tariffs. So when we're talking about the concept of a utility meter, if we were talking specifically about power, you might define something like peak, off-peak, and shoulder. And then you would need to also set up an automation to switch between the tariffs that the sensor is calculating against. There's also an option for whether this utility meter is going to show the net value, meaning that it can both increase and decrease the value of the sensor. And there's also the option for if the values are what's called delta values, i.e. it only shows you the change since the last reading of an absolute value. The last helper entity that I'll talk about here is the Riemann Sum integral sensor. Now, Riemann sum is a method to calculate the area below a curve in a graph. And the concept here is that you can use Riemann sum to calculate the change of a sensor over a period of time. The example most often used is to take the input from an energy sensor and calculate the number of kilowatt hours consumed over a time period. Using a Riemann sum sensor, if it's configured appropriately, you should be able to add the energy sensors from, say, the 2-year integration or any other integration that doesn't actually support long-term statistics in Home Assistant to the Home Assistant energy dashboard. Now, I'm planning a full video on the Riemann sum integration in future, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on that when it comes out. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's worth mentioning that some add-on integrations like garbage collection from Hacks add other helper entities to Home Assistant as well. So look out for those when you're adding Hacks integrations. That is all we have for this video. I do hope that it helped you in some way in your home automation journey. Be sure to comment down below with home automation ideas you'd like to see me cover in a future video. Don't forget to also follow HiveMind Automation on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you like this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up button down below to give it a like. That will help the YouTube algorithm to recommend it to more viewers. If you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing now, and while you're at it, if you hit the bell icon, you'll get a notification when I release new videos, and that tends to be every week. If you're currently in the market for a VPN provider, there's an affiliate link for NordVPN in the video description as well. I chose to partner with NordVPN because they have the best infrastructure of any of the VPN providers I looked into. They have a strict no-logs policy and servers all over the planet. On top of that, they've got apps for just about every platform around, including Windows, Mac, Linux, iOS, and Android. So no matter what platform you're using, you can protect your sensitive personal information while you browse the web, and that's even on unsecured Wi-Fi. So get a VPN today and use my link below to sign up for NordVPN. Lastly, if you like what I'm doing here and you want to help to support the channel directly, there is a Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description down below. Any contributions that you make through Buy Me a Coffee will be put towards making more and better content for you to enjoy. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Stu from HiveMind Automation, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.